And our last story today is from Malawi, which has frozen exports of precious minerals and gemstones. The Southeast African country has also decided not to issue new licenses and permits to companies. The government claims this will help to sanitize the mining sector and to boost the country's economic standing.
We cannot continue as a country and continent whereby we send our resources to be processed in other countries, which means we are importing jobs for our young people.
Now, the president of the Association of Ghana Industries has presented two policy proposals to government. The first is a total ban on export of raw materials, including cocoa, so as to create an enabling environment for industries to add value to these materials.
To some extent, some agricultural products should be banned from export in their raw state. I say this, and I know it shall be a provocative statement. Why should it be the case that paddy rice should be exported in its raw state?
The country needs the money, and it has the diamonds, and somebody who's supposed to be selling the diamonds is not doing the job. Oh no. And we are simply sitting on our laurels, folding up our arms and hoping, beyond hope, that this... No. I will take the diamonds and see what we can do with it. They are ours. These diamonds are ours.
President Bola Tinubu has approved a 6-month temporary ban on the export of raw shea nut to curb informal trade, boost local processing, as well as protect and grow Nigeria's shea nut industry.
This is a pro-value addition policy designed to secure raw materials for our processing factories.
I said over my dead body, I have banned all the export of unprocessed minerals from here. Let them stay in the ground. When the grandchildren come, they will get them.
This country shouldn't be where it is. This country shouldn't be in debt. There's no way. It is unjustifiable. I cannot, by the life in me, understand why we are where we are. I cannot. I refuse to embrace this unpleasant reality. I refuse. I am a persistent objector to this conventional and mundane existence.
This is not a drill. In a move that is sending shockwaves through global markets, multiple African nations have simultaneously restricted the export of critical raw materials resources Western economies depend on to function. Factories are scrambling, prices are reacting, supply chains are tightening. And for the first time in decades, the balance of leverage in the global resource economy is shifting away from the West. This isn't diplomacy, it's economic pressure, and the consequences are only beginning. For decades, Western economies operated under a quiet assumption: critical raw materials would always be available, minerals would flow, contracts would be honored. Supply chains, no matter how stretched, would hold. That assumption just fractured when 10 African nations moved to restrict or ban exports of key raw materials. The decision didn't arrive with dramatic speeches or military displays. It arrived through policy notices, export controls, and regulatory changes, but the impact was immediate. Commodity traders reacted first. Prices surged across multiple sectors as uncertainty rippled through futures markets. Manufacturers followed, scrambling to assess exposure, inventory levels, and alternative suppliers. Governments, meanwhile, rushed to reassure industries that contingency plans existed. Behind the scenes, panic spread faster than official statements suggested. The materials involved were not symbolic, they were foundational: cobalt for batteries, lithium for electric vehicles, bauxite for aluminum, rare earths for electronics and defense systems, uranium for energy. These are not luxuries, they are the backbone of modern economies, and many of them are concentrated geologically and politically in Africa. For years, African countries supplied these resources under terms that heavily favored external buyers. Raw materials left the continent, value was added elsewhere. Profits accumulated far from the mines and ports where extraction occurred. That imbalance fueled a growing frustration. Local economies saw little transformation. Infrastructure lagged, employment gains were limited. Environmental costs stayed local. What changed was leverage. As global demand surged, driven by energy transitions, electric vehicles, digital infrastructure, and geopolitical competition, African producers realized something critical. The world needed these materials more than ever, and alternatives were limited. This wasn't about ideology, it was about timing. The decision to restrict exports was not spontaneous. It was the result of years of planning, coordination, and recalibration. Some countries cited domestic processing goals, others emphasized national development, industrialization, or supply security. But the message was consistent: access would no longer be unconditional. Western economies felt the pressure almost instantly. Manufacturers reliant on just-in-time supply chains found themselves exposed. Stockpiles proved thinner than expected. Long-term contracts offered less protection than assumed when export permits were suddenly delayed or denied. Prices responded upward, not because production collapsed but because predictability did. Markets fear uncertainty more than scarcity. As analysts recalculated supply risk, the cost of doing business rose. Inflationary pressures resurfaced. Strategic industries from automotive to aerospace flagged concerns. Energy transitions, already strained, faced a new obstacle: material bottlenecks. Electric vehicle production targets were quietly revised. Battery manufacturers warned of delays. Defense planners reassessed sourcing vulnerabilities that had long been ignored. This wasn't just an economic event, it was a strategic wake-up call. For African nations, the move marked a turning point. Instead of exporting raw materials at the lowest point in the value chain, governments began pushing for domestic processing, refining, and manufacturing. Export restrictions were leverage, not isolation. The objective was clear: keep more value at home, build industries, create jobs, negotiate from strength. This shift unsettled Western policymakers accustomed to stable access. Diplomatic channels activated, trade envoys flew, quiet pressure followed, but leverage had already changed hands. Once multiple suppliers move in concert, alternatives shrink rapidly. Diversification, long encouraged, proved harder in practice than theory suggested. New mining projects take years. Recycling capacity is limited. Substitutes often don't exist. The global system, optimized for efficiency, revealed its fragility. What made this moment different was coordination. 10 nations acting independently would have been manageable. 10 acting simultaneously changed the equation. This wasn't a shutdown of global trade, it was a recalibration of terms, and it signaled something deeper. African countries were no longer content with being passive suppliers in a system designed elsewhere. They were asserting agency. For Western economies, the challenge wasn't just sourcing materials, it was adapting to a world where access now required negotiation, partnership, and compromise. The old model, cheap inputs, distant extraction, externalized costs, was under strain. What comes next will define the next decade of global economics, because when control over resources shifts, power follows, and the countries that adapt fastest will determine whether this moment becomes a temporary shock or the beginning of a new global order. In the next phase, we'll examine how Western governments and corporations are responding behind closed doors and whether their strategies are enough to regain stability in a world that no longer runs on old assumptions. The public response was calm. Official statements emphasized cooperation, dialogue, and partnership. Governments reassured markets that supply chains were resilient and that diversification strategies were already in motion. Behind closed doors, the tone was very different. Emergency meetings were convened across capitals, industry. Executives were summoned. Defense planners, energy regulators, and trade officials suddenly found themselves in the same rooms, asking the same uncomfortable question: how exposed are we? What they discovered was unsettling. Years of efficiency-driven globalization had stripped away buffers. Stockpiles were thinner than models assumed. Redundancy had been sacrificed for cost savings. And in many sectors, dependence on African raw materials was not marginal, it was structural. The automotive industry felt it first. Electric vehicle targets had been set aggressively, driven by climate commitments and political pressure. Those targets assumed uninterrupted access to battery minerals. When export restrictions tightened, procurement teams scrambled to renegotiate contracts that no longer guaranteed delivery. Some manufacturers quietly slowed production. Others revised timelines. Publicly, nothing changed. Privately, forecasts were being rewritten. Energy planners faced similar problems. Uranium supply security, long treated as a solved issue, re-emerged as a vulnerability. Utilities reassessed fuel cycles. Strategic reserves were reviewed. In some cases, contingency plans that hadn't been touched in decades were pulled from archives and updated. Defense sectors raised alarms that rarely reached headlines. Modern weapons systems rely on specialized minerals often sourced from a small number of countries. Export restrictions introduced uncertainty into procurement pipelines that had been assumed stable. For planners accustomed to guaranteed access, this represented a strategic shock. The immediate instinct was diversification. Governments pushed companies to seek alternative suppliers in Latin America, Australia, and Central Asia. New trade missions were launched, exploration permits were fast-tracked, subsidies were proposed, but reality intervened. New mines take years to develop, infrastructure takes longer, community opposition, environmental reviews, and capital constraints slowed progress. Diversification was possible but not fast. That time gap was Africa's leverage. As Western negotiators reached out, African governments negotiated from a position they had never held before. Instead of being asked how much can you supply, they were asked what do you want? And the answers were consistent: local processing, technology transfer, infrastructure investment, equity participation. Long-term contracts that guaranteed development, not just extraction. This marked a profound shift in the relationship. For decades, access to capital and markets flowed one way. Now access to resources required concessions. Some Western firms resisted, others adapted. Joint ventures replaced simple supply agreements. Refining and processing facilities were planned closer to mines. Training programs and local employment guarantees became part of negotiations. These deals were more complex, more expensive, and far less favorable than the old model. But the alternative was exclusion. Financial markets reacted cautiously. Share prices of resource-dependent companies reflected rising risk premiums. Investors demanded clarity on supply exposure. Analysts began factoring geopolitical risk into sectors that had previously been evaluated purely on fundamentals. Insurance costs rose. Hedging became more expensive. Margins tightened. At the policy level, uncomfortable debates resurfaced. Should strategic reserves be expanded? Should domestic mining be subsidized despite environmental opposition? Should resource access be treated as a national security issue rather than a market transaction? There were no easy answers. What became clear was that the old assumption that markets alone could guarantee supply was no longer valid. Africa's coordinated action had exposed a blind spot. The West had optimized for price, Africa optimized for leverage, and leverage was now determining terms. Not all responses were cooperative. Quiet pressure campaigns emerged. Diplomatic leverage was applied. Aid, trade preferences, and security partnerships were subtly linked to resource discussions. But these tactics had limits. African governments, aware of their position, coordinated messaging and timelines. Fragmentation, the traditional weakness, was reduced. Unity amplified influence. Meanwhile, other global players watched closely. China adjusted strategy but did not retreat. Emerging economies accelerated their own outreach. Competition for access intensified. This global scramble revealed a deeper truth. Raw materials were no longer just commodities, they were instruments of policy. The West had entered a new phase of global competition, one where control over resources mattered as much as control over technology or finance. By the end of this phase, one thing was undeniable. The export restrictions were not temporary disruptions, they were signals. Signals that the era of passive resource supply was ending, and signals that future access would be conditional. The question was no longer whether the West could adapt, it was whether adaptation would come fast enough, because while negotiations continued and strategies evolved, the clock was ticking. Industries cannot pause indefinitely, transitions cannot wait, and leverage, once established, rarely disappears. In the final act, we'll examine what this means long-term, whether this moment marks a temporary correction or the start of a permanent rebalancing of global economic power.